Hi everybody, welcome to Dynamo Sword Channel. I'm David, and today on Dynamo Sword Channel, I will be presenting episode 2 of my series Discussion Topics. Today, the discussion will be on my personal classification of the different types of medieval swords. Now, to be clear, this is not a discussion per se on blade typologies, but more specifically the different types of medieval European swords from the 9th century to the late 16th century by size and grip length. Now, this type listing isn't necessarily official, though it does take general terminology as well as my own insight to make a more concrete description of each type of medieval sword. So to start, let's look at what traits of a sword make it a European medieval sword. So what defines a medieval European sword at the most basic design is a straight double-edged blade with a hilt consisting of a crossguard, grip, and pommel. The blades could be of various lengths and profiles with variation to the cross section as well as fullering of various shapes and lengths. The crossguards also featured variation in style and shape, some being basic straight bars to the more intricate curved and swept styles. A pommel is the bottom part of the hilt and was used to not only assemble the hilt, usually via a peen, but also to help counterbalance the weight of the sword. Pommels, like crossguards, also came in various styles and shapes, from the more basic wheel pommels to the more intricate scent stopper and polygonal styles. Now that we know what defines a medieval European sword, we can now look at the differences between the different types of medieval swords in the most simplistic respect. A little history will help us see how these swords were designed and how they evolved over time. The medieval sword was a progressive evolution of the earlier bronze and iron swords of Europe. We first start seeing the general shape and design of what would be the medieval sword in the ancient swords of Persia and Greece. These swords, known as akinaka and xiphos, were short, double-edged swords consisting of a hilt usually compact in design but featuring the retaining stylization of what we would see evolve into the crossguard and pommel configuration. As these swords influenced other nations, we see the evolution of the xiphos to the Roman gladius and the Celtic Hallstatt swords, which evolved into the Roman spatha, which in turn inspired the Germanic swords of the migration period. From there, we see another step towards the evolution of the European sword in the Carolingian swords or Viking swords down to the medieval sword we are discussing today. As you can see, there is much history and evolution to the European sword over the centuries, with many cultures and nations influencing the evolution of the European sword. Next, let's look at the types of medieval swords we will be classifying and discussing today. In my classification, there are 6 types of medieval swords based on blade length, grip length, and blade function, as well as general use and carry. There are arming swords, war swords, hand-and-a-half swords, long swords, riding swords, and great swords. Again, all of these are types commonly discussed and are terms used to describe swords, but remember, this is my personal terminology of describing medieval swords based on my study and research, and is not meant to dispute or discredit any previous works or terminology to describe medieval swords. Hopefully, my classification helps you in your own path of research and enthusiasm and is not taken hostile or negatively by any who view it. With that, let's look at our first type of sword, the arming sword. What defines an arming sword is its shorter, single-handed grip length of 3 to 4 inches and a blade length that averages around 30 to 35 inches. This is the most generic type of medieval sword and takes its influence from earlier period Viking swords. The earliest arming swords featured blades similar to the previous Viking type, having broad, straight, double-edged blade with deep, long fullers reaching 7/8 of the blade length and ending in a more spatulate tip. In the Oakshot typology, these blades are what is known as a Type 10. Now, what really made the medieval arming sword different than the Viking swords of earlier centuries was the change of the hilt. The hilt of the medieval sword is where we first see the upper and lower guards of the Viking sword replaced with the standard medieval pommel and cross guard known as a cruciform hilt. The cruciform hilt was the base hilt formation of the medieval sword up until the late Renaissance, when the more intricate swept hilting took prominence. The arming sword was primarily paired with a shield, much like earlier Viking swords, but some were also used in conjunction with the smaller buckler or another offhand weapon, or were even used on horseback. There are also some variants of the arming sword which feature longer than average blade lengths and were primarily used on horseback, which one could describe as early cavalry swords. These swords feature thinner blade profiles and longer than average blade lengths between 34 and 37 inches. A prime example of the early cavalry sword can be seen in the 11th and 12th century Type 11 seen here. As armor developed over the centuries, so did the arming sword, with various blade profiles and cross sections being utilized to make the sword more efficient as a weapon of war. Regarding the Oakshot typology, nearly all blade types of the typology have an arming sword variant, with most core types denoting arming swords. Such types as the 10, 10A, 11, 11A, 12, 13B, 14, 15, 16, 18, 19, 20A, 21, and 22. As such, the arming sword showed its prominence as the prime sword of the medieval period, seeing use throughout the period and eventually evolving into the side sword and rapier of the 16th and 17th centuries. Next, we'll look at the second type of medieval sword, the war sword. This can be one of the more confusing or controversial terms, but hopefully I can show you the war sword merits its own place as a type and why. Basically, the conclusion comes from the similarities between the war sword and the long sword. While both are very similar, there are defining traits of both types that make them significantly different than one another. By specifics, what I phrase as the war sword begins seeing develop in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. What defines a war sword as opposed to a long sword is a prominence as a battlefield weapon. These swords were large and imposing swords, with blade lengths between 32 and 40 inches and grip lengths between 6 and 10 inches on average. These long blades featured broad, slightly tapering profiles, normally of lanicular cross-section, and their primary use was cutting, with some featuring acute tips for thrusting. The grips were long and offered the user the ability to comfortably grip the sword with two hands, as these swords were intended to be used. The hilt was much like earlier period arming swords, cruciform in style, with the majority featuring simple straight guards and wheel pommels as seen here. Regarding the Oakshot typology, these specific early war swords can be seen exclusively in both the Type 12A and 13A war swords, with the 13A being as an example here. But there was a resurgence of the war sword type at the later part of the medieval and Renaissance periods. These later war swords, also known as bastard swords in most context, begin seeing use in the later 15th and early 16th centuries. A rise in ballistic weapons on the battlefield saw a decrease in the use of full plate armor, and a window of opportunity for the war sword to gain prominence as an imposing battlefield weapon returned. These later period war swords were just as imposing as the earlier types, but featured advances in blade design such as cross-section, ricassos, as well as more intricate hilting for defense. Most later period war swords post-date the Oakshot typology, but we can see blades of the type 17, 19, 20, and 20A, with a 20 being shown as an example here, being primary examples of the later period war sword. The war sword had a prominent significance due to it being a primary battlefield weapon in both time points of the medieval period. Our third type is what is known as the hand and a half sword. Also known as bastard swords in more modern context, the hand and a half sword is a bit of a conundrum like the war sword. The most basic way to describe a hand and a half sword is a sword between the standard single-handed arming sword and the two-handed war sword and long sword. It can be difficult to decipher a hand and a half sword from the two later types because really it could in fact be either one. What really differentiates it is having both a shorter length blade and a grip shorter than your average long sword, but also a little bit longer than your average arming sword. As such, the defining traits of a hand and a half sword would be a blade length between 30 and 35 inches and a grip length of 5 to 8 inches on average. The other thing that differentiates the hand and a half sword is its versatility, being able to be used one or two-handed with ease. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use the other types one or two-handed, but since the primary design of those two types is to exemplify specific use, the hand and a half sword has the unique versatility to be used either way. For example, using a shield with a war sword or long sword would be cumbersome for the average person, but with a hand and a half sword, you have more freedom to use a shield or even another offhand weapon. Due to its versatility, we see many blades in the Oakshot typology feature hand and a half sword proportions, such as the types 13, 15A, 18A, as seen here, and type 19, showing the variety hand and a half swords can have in blade profile and function, with these various blade types featuring both primarily cut-focused blades as well as also thrusting and cut and thrust blade profiles. Next, we have the second most popular sword type of the medieval period, long swords. The long sword, much like the war sword, is defined by having a long blade between the length of 32 and 40 inches and a grip length between the lengths of 6 and 10 inches on average. So, you might be asking, what differentiates a long sword from a war sword? Well, as we learned earlier, the war sword is defined by its primary use as a battlefield weapon. A long sword is defined by being primarily a civilian weapon. Now, this doesn't mean long swords were not used on the battlefield. That is far, far from the truth. But what it means is that at the time and use of the long sword, we see more use off the battlefield, thus defining it as a civilian weapon. So what is a civilian weapon? A civilian weapon or sword is defined as being a sword carried around in or used outside war. A civilian weapon would be carried at the hip and would be seen throughout town and used for self-defense, duels, or even to denote rank. Much like with arming swords, Sword carry was quite common, especially amongst the nobility and knights of medieval Europe. Basically, it was more a personal preference of what to carry. Did the person prefer a single-handed sword or a two-handed sword? Also, what were they trained in, and of course the laws and regulations of carry amongst the commoner and noble in their respective nation. As long swords became more popular, especially in the later 14th and early 15th centuries, you begin to see more carry and use of long swords in general. You also see the prominence of the cut and thrust blade profile, as well as cross sections, those blades of that type featured, such as diamond and hexagonal cross sections. You also see a larger resurgence of Western martial arts, focusing on longsword techniques. The benefit of a longsword over an arming sword are clearly its longer blade length and the ability to use it two hands, which allows more control over the sword and, of course, additional reach that keeps you at a safer distance from your opponent, armed or unarmed. In the Oakshot typology, we also see many blade types that fit into the longsword type. For example, the types 15A, 16A, which is represented here, 17, 18A, 18B, 18C, 19, and 20A. Now, three of those types also fit into the war sword classification, namely the type 17, 19, and 20A, as they were primarily battlefield weapons. But due to their more thrust-oriented blade profiles and the focus of the longsword type being a primarily later cut and thrust profiles, they also fit into the longsword type. Next, we have another more obscure sword type, the riding sword. What defines a riding sword is primarily a shorter than average blade length between 24 and 30 inches, and a single-handed grip between 3 and 4 inches. The primary use of the riding sword was similar to the longsword, with both being civilian weapons. In the later medieval period, it seems shorter arming swords were preferred when worn daily in court. Of course, this type didn't make arming swords, long swords, or even hand-and-a-half swords obsolete as civilian weapons, as they were all equally worn and used as well. It just seems that from the late 14th to the early 16th century, shorter than average swords were popular more than likely due to convenience and just being generally more comfortable to wear and less cumbersome indoors. Many late Renaissance riding swords that have survived also have the defining trait of being quite exquisite and intricate compared to other sword types, often featuring finely crafted and gilded hilts to show a noble standing, prestige, as well as the general wealth of the owner. These later riding swords also had unique blade profiles and fuller terminations, being quite broad at the base and tapering to a more acute tip. They also almost always lack a pommel and feature a more compact hilt. Most riding swords featuring these blade profiles and unique hilting fit into what is known as the quinquera sword style. Regarding the Oakshot typology, riding swords can be seen in quite a few blade types, such as the 16, 18, 19, 21, and 22. It could be presumed that the shorter blades of the Type 14 could also be considered riding swords. The Type 14 swords, as seen here, an example seen here, primarily differ though due to their more prominent use on the battlefield compared to the civilian carry style riding swords. But it wouldn't be wrong to consider them riding swords though, based on their shorter length and similarity to other 14th century riding swords. So finally, we have come to the last sword type, great swords. A great sword can be described as a large two-handed sword with an overall length larger than your standard longsword or war sword. The blade length of a greatsword can be anywhere from 40 to 60 inches on average, with grip lengths being between 12 and 20 inches on average. As you can see, these swords are massive and were a unique sword that is often misunderstood. The greatsword sees its design stem from the earlier war swords. The type seems to have originated in Germany in the later 15th century, but soon many nations began using these swords, such as England, Scotland, Spain, Italy, and of course, various nations in Scandinavia, with each having unique designs to their swords. For example, the famous Scottish claymore, as seen here, the English Tudor sword, the Italian Venetian sword style, German Munich sword style, as well as the Danish greatsword style. A greatsword's primary function was a frontline weapon to combat pike formations and cavalry. Its extra long blade and grip allowed for great reach and leverage to deliver powerful, deadly cuts. These swords were also very psychologically intimidating and were used to great benefit in that regard. For example, with the Scottish Highland Charge or the Swiss and German Langshank formations. As opposed to most depictions of the great sword in film and video games, this type of sword was not carried or used like your standard longsword, nor were they ever really used for duels. These were definitely primary battlefield weapons, with the only exception being the bearing swords of ceremony and parade. Bearing swords were similar in size to great swords, but were not built for functional use and featured much more intricate and aesthetic hilting and embellishment. Some key defining traits of great swords are the various unique styles of cross guards and small protrusions above the ricasso known as parrying lugs and hooks. The cross guards of most great swords featured long quillions and normally featured ring guards and incursions at the center of the guard. But some styles were unique to the nations that used them. For example, the up-curved quarterfoil guard of the Scottish Highland Claymore, as opposed to this variation, which is known as the Lowland Claymore. Pommels were normally of globular or sit stopper design, and the blades could be either a broad lanicular or hexagonal cross sections, as seen here, with various fullering, or thinly acuted pointed for thrusting with diamond or hexagonal cross sections. But there were also the unique Flamberg style blade, featuring waved or scalloped edges to create more cutting surface and deliver wider and more damaging thrusting wounds. Regarding the Oakshot typology, most if not all great swords post-date the typology, but there are a few examples with blades similar to the types 13A, 15A, 17, 20, and 20A. There is, of course, the Scandinavian style greatswords, which Oakshot placed as their own unique type, the type 18E in the Oakshot typology. This blade type is unique by having a concave ricasso at the base of the blade, transitioning to a thin, acutely tapering profile of diamond cross section. It seems this type was exclusive to the Scandinavian nations and is one of the few examples of the greatsword with an acute blade tip type, with focus on thrusting similar to the types 15 and 17 in the Oakshot typology. The greatsword had a rather short lifespan, but it would be hard to not refute its prominence as the most imposing and awe-inspiring of the medieval sword types. Of course, there are other unique types of medieval swords, such as the hunting swords, executioner swords, falchion, and messers. But in this classification, I wanted to focus on the more standard types of double-edged swords of medieval Europe. But there might be a discussion topic video in the future featuring these obscure and more unique medieval swords. Well, I hope you enjoyed this discussion on my classification of the different types of medieval European swords. Be sure to like and subscribe, as well as leave comments and questions. And of course, look for future discussion topics right here on Dynamo Sword Channel. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.